Yeah, welcome everybody to the third webinar of the Arcadia series. Today, as a presenter, we have Tudor Stăncioiu, who's a professor of forest ecology and forest stand dynamics at the Transilvania University of Brașov in Romania. Before joining academia, he worked in forest administration departments. He holds a doctoral degree in environmental science, policy, and management at the University of Berkeley in California, US. His current work is focusing on forest dynamics, species habitat relationships, and the sustainable management of forests, also including certification. Today he is going to talk to us about climate and biodiversity smart forestry, specifically on opportunities and challenges in Romania. I ask the audience to keep their microphone off during the presentation. We will collect questions for the discussion at the end of the presentation. So you're free to write in the chat your questions. We will collect them and bring them forward at the end. So with that said, I again remind everyone that has joined now that this meeting is being recorded. So if you prefer to keep your microphone and camera off, you're welcome to do so. And with that said, I leave the floor to you, Tudor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Gloria, for the introduction and for the invitation to this event. It's my pleasure to present you some things about the forest and forestry in Romania and some of the, let's say, recent challenges, but also opportunities in terms of making the forests more resilient to climate change. I will present here some of the results we had in another Horizon project called ForestPaths, which has been recently, we had an event recently here in Romania on climate and biodiversity smart forestry issues. What is ForestPaths? It aims to help EU to co-design holistic forest-based policy pathways because we need to reduce greenhouse gases and also to increase our biodiversity. It's a project run by 15 partners from 10 European countries with very different climates and traditions in forest management. CMCC is a partner in this project as well. Our focus is to better understand how European forest management is done right now in very different countries and to identify possible measures which would be climate and also biodiversity smart. How to do that? To meet these goals, we would like to improve data and tools and methods for the European forest-based sector. Of course, we would like to have a better understanding of the disturbances and all the other problems that climate change is bringing. The project aims to develop next generation models, which would be helpful for the EU to take decisions at EU level. Also doing this, we would like to involve practitioners and owners to get the best feedback from them. And then to reach these climate and biodiversity smart options, which would help in the end EU to hopefully have a holistic forest-based policy in this area. It is a big challenge. So this was let's say, the main focus of a demo case meeting that we had earlier this year in May in Romania. What is climate and biodiversity smart? This is a relatively new term. We have many new terms nowadays. It's rooted in the sustainable forest management and the climate smart forestry. So it's kind of sustainable forest management redefined in terms of focusing more on the climate problems. And therefore, this kind of management is seeking adaptation and mitigation while maintaining the forest's ability to give us all the ecosystem services. So it takes into account also bioeconomy. The climate and biodiversity smart forest management is, let's say, the sustainable forest management or the climate smart forestry, which was already defined, which places also a special emphasis on biodiversity, making it a more special ecosystem service, among others. Well, I don't know if that is necessarily, I mean, we have many ecosystem services which are very important, and all of them are important. But anyway, apparently, or this is what people believe, that biodiversity would be like an umbrella service, which if we have high biodiversity, then we'll have the others as well. So what are the three pillars for the climate and biodiversity smart forestry? Would be mitigation. So we would like to reduce these heat-trapping greenhouse gases, either in forest biomass and soil, which would be let's say the job of the foresters, but then it's not stopping in the forest. It's also along the value chain, which is very important as well. The second pillar would be, just a second. Oh, adaptation to prepare the forest, what is now and what is coming. So we would like them to be both resistant and resilient. And yes, the one that I mentioned earlier, we will also want them to be highly biodiverse if possible. So we want stable, vigorously growing, and biodiverse forests. Again, it's not something completely new, but now it's, let's say, put in a different perspective. How to do that? The demo case in Romania was built to start from thinking of what are the climate challenges we see in Romania, and then talk about how forest management should be adapted to these. And then identify what are the management practices which should be implemented to increase biodiversity and ecological value, which practices should be implemented to respond to climate change, so to build resistant and resilient forests, and then think of what is stopping us to do this and what is helping us to do this. So all participants, which were coming from, most of them were practitioners, but they also we had also some representatives of owners and also of the state-controlled institutions in Romania. They were asked to think of these options that I'll present later, and then classify them in terms of their impact on the three pillars: mitigation, adaptation, and biodiversity. The first part of the meeting was only to identify which would be the best way to manage the forest. So not thinking of not having enough money, not having tools, not having legislation. So it was just an open discussion, a free mind discussion, trying to identify the best tools to do climate and biodiversity smart forestry. And then later on, we had an indoors meeting where we discussed, okay, so if this is good, how can we do it? Or is already happening? And what could be a barrier for implementation? So all the participants were asked to classify different options, which are on the left, in terms of their impact on mitigation, plus positive or negative, or both, or zero, okay? And then on adaptation and then on biodiversity. To do this, to discuss this, we started by discussing the present rules we have in Romania. And then also, after discussing them, we were asking them to think of new options or additional options. Now, these are on the left, there are the rules which are applied nationwide in Romania. Romania has a very centralized system of forest management. It is strictly controlled by the state. So all the owners follow the same set of rules, regardless of size of ownership or type of ownership. So one of the rules is that you as an owner or manager are obliged by the state to maintain a natural composition of the forest. So if you have, I don't know, European beech or oak forest, after you harvest it, you must replace it by an oak or beech forest again. So what is the outcome? We have diverse native tree species assemblages, and very simplified compositions are very rare and are a mistake. Also for planting, owners are also forced by the rules to use adapted native species. So they are not allowed, for example, like in Germany, to use, for example, Douglas fir, which is very productive and apparently very resistant to these new challenges. This is not allowed in Romania. So we have close to natural composition even in plantations. Silvicultural treatment, so the way the forest is harvested to replace the old forest with the young forest, those that predominate are with natural regeneration under shelter, which means that the old forest is harvested in more steps and to favor regeneration to come under the shelter of the mature trees and then is released. Clear cutting is very rare, although in the media it's probably a different image. Harvesting maintains the stumps, roots, and harvesting debris, which remains in the forest. The rules say that harvesting should avoid soil erosion. So it is a kind of harvesting which has a reduced impact on the carbon pool in the soil and also ensure some habitat by that root. Long rotations, which means how long it takes for a forest to be harvested finally. In Romania, it's over 100 years, even 120 sometimes or more. And we have old growth forests or virgin forests, which are protected by law. So we have forests of very different ages, but we have the old forest stage constantly present, which is large carbon stock and standing timber, but also important for some species. One interesting rule, which comes from Western Europe, the principle of sustained yield, which means that an owner should aim for having in its own ownership all development stages of a forest or stands of very different ages in a more or less balanced proportion, which will bring a continuous yield. But this also is very important for biodiversity because you have in your ownership all stages of the development, all kinds of structures and all kinds of habitats. Conservation of deadwood in certain quantities, more in the certified forests, less in others, but there is no clean forest. Also, some of the rare ecosystems in the forest, like riparian vegetation, swamps, bog, woodlands, screes, are also maintained. Another particular aspect during the last quarter of the period of life of the forest, the rotation, you are allowed to do only sanitation cuttings. We call it a tranquility period, and it is like 30 years where you're not allowed to do thinning or other more intense harvesting. And the Romanian law is very strict when it comes to changing land use of forest land. It is very expensive and very complicated, and actually is impossible. The state is deciding, even if it's your own forest, if you want to change the land use, you can do it by paying very high costs for very small areas. Otherwise, for areas larger than a hectare or something, a government decision is needed, and the government would never decide to give you that right. So the maintenance of forest land area and its connectivity is very good because of that. Some other ideas that came out of the discussion were changing the stand composition, the present composition, because we believe that the climate will change, then other species might be favored. So participants were talking about changing the proportion of species, the provenances of seeds in the next forest, or even bringing new species in, native species, which are not yet there, or exotic species. And they also talked about the thinning, applying the so-called tending operations, which are operations. I'm sorry, I forgot to ask, but I believe that many people don't know the forestry technical terms. I'm trying to be explicit, but then ask me afterwards and I'll try to explain them again. Thinning is a tending operation which is done in young forests with the aim to promote the more vigorous or the best trees and take out the weak trees or let's say the unwanted species. So all these have been discussed in the field. People were asked to put pluses or minuses for adaptation, mitigation, and biodiversity, and then we have discussed them inside. So the outcomes of the discussions were that for the first one, so having forests with a natural composition, which means using native species, was considered important, like positive, for all three pillars. So mitigation, adaptation, and biodiversity. What is enabling this? Well, it's mandatory by the state rules. This could become in the future maybe a barrier. So there are no barriers so far because you're forced to, but it is quite costly, and for private owners, it's very costly. And if they are not large owners to afford it, it's very costly. So participants were saying that to have this in place in the future, the state should start pay for it. The same with planting the best adapted native species. They're considered by most participants important for all three pillars. It is again mandatory. Here, the low flexibility in implementation on the ground was a complaint, let's say. They said that even telling the proportion by the rules is too much. So they would expect more flexibility, even for getting better adapted future forests, not necessarily for economic reasons. The fact that the regeneration of the forest is done mostly by treatments which promote regeneration under the shelter of the mature trees was also considered important. Again, there is no flexibility, and this flexibility in implementation on the ground, the reality in the field is very different than the books. But if the rules are quite intricate and detailed, then it's very hard to apply them in the field. And we have in Romania additional restrictions in Natura 2000 because they were declared protected areas. So it's quite a challenge. Clear cutting, which is less than 5% of the total area of the forest land, is very restricted, and now it's foreseen to be forbidden in Natura 2000 sites with no scientific reason, and actually with quite few negative effects on forests. In Romania, is allowed only in pure spruce forests or pure pine forests, and not on steep slopes, and so far on areas less than 3 hectares, so they're very small. It's very different than in Nordic countries. Leaving stumps and roots and waste and undergrowth in the forest after harvesting was also considered important, mostly for mitigation and biodiversity and less for adaptation, but not necessarily that it has a negative impact on adaptation. Okay. So far, there is no problem. It is imposed somehow by harvesting rules, but anyway, harvesting waste removal is not economically attractive. It could be a challenge in the future because harvesting waste may become attractive for biomass use. Not the stumps and the roots, which you are not allowed to take out, but the tree tops and branches. The principle of sustained yield, which is producing these landscapes with all development stages of the forest, so forests of very different ages and types and structures. It is mandatory for all owners. It was considered important for the participants, more for adaptation and biodiversity, and less for mitigation. It is, as a barrier, it is not applicable on very small ownership. The state doesn't require it on very small ownership. And it has some administrative burden in it. So private owners were expecting that some incentives or compensations would be a better enabler than imposing it through strict rules. So, for example, if you have, I don't know, a large share in your ownership of old forests, you're not allowed to harvest all of them just because the market is high. You need to aim to make a balance in terms of proportion of each forest age class in your ownership. So it's quite difficult. Long rotations considered to be important, but more for mitigation and biodiversity. Again, is mandatory. No flexibility here. Many owners complain about this because in many cases, the timber, when you harvest the forest after 120 years, is of quite lower quality than before. So they would expect some incentives or compensations or some more flexibility, at least in some cases. Keeping deadwood in certain quantities was mainly for biodiversity. It is a requirement in certified forest, also in Natura 2000 sites, and is not attractive for removal in many cases. So most of the forests in Romania have enough deadwood. However, there are no clear amounts provided by legislation. Sometimes the amounts are very high and there are no incentives or compensations offered. So this could be in the future a barrier. Conserving some rare ecosystems inside a forest is mostly important for biodiversity and adaptation. It's most an owner's decision to safeguard biodiversity. Some are improper for forest use, so they are just left there because there is no way you will obtain a forest by planting it. But then again, it's a lack of incentives or compensations for those that do this. The last quarter of the rotation, the tranquility period, it was considered very important only for biodiversity. It is mandatory by the state rules. This is a high cost, very high cost, and private owners expect that they should be rewarded. I don't know if in any European countries there is such rule. So in the last 30 years, they're not allowed to do anything except some sanitation cuttings. But because they are not appealing, they don't happen usually. Conservation of rare ecosystems. Oh, sorry, this was the title is wrong. This was the landscape use, the land use change. It was considered important for all three pillars. It is highly controlled by law, and the participants were not asking for changing land use to build, I don't know, hotels or something else, but they're asking for more flexibility for forest management use, like log yards. or roads. I mean, for roads, you do have that chance, but not for log yards or other areas for administration purposes, which makes forest management very difficult. And those would be very helpful for degrading less the soil and everything. Some of the new proposals maintain stand composition, but change the proportion of the species. They consider it very important for adaptation, and they were asking for more flexibility. At present, it's impossible because they're not allowed by the norms. Mixing provenances, so bringing seeds from different areas to have a mix of provenances and maybe having the same species but with better adapted trees to different kinds of climates was also considered important. Regulations at present are flexible, so they could do that, but it is not written in the rules that you should do that because it's better. So it's happening by mistake or by chance. And in the future, the EU regulations, I think, are under revision right now. So we don't know what they will tell about this. Changing stand composition by bringing new native species, the so-called assisted migration, was also considered important, mainly for adaptation. Guidelines, again, if they would be more flexible, it would be possible, but at this moment, you are not allowed to do that. And bringing exotic species was considered important mainly for adaptation, but with negative effect on biodiversity. So far is not allowed by the state rules. Anyway, the participants were asking more for using some exotic species more like experimental, so on small areas, just to see how it works. Probably because they are used to these rules, forcing them for almost 100 years to keep the native species. Applying tending operations with the proper intensity and at the proper time. Although it sounds easy, it is not always happening, because these, at least before trees have a commercial size, these are only costs, and they're quite costly. So they are enforced by the rules, but the bureaucracy is quite high and should be reduced. It is quite difficult to do them. I mean, it's costly. So this is an important barrier, and that's why in many places they don't, they're not implemented at the right time and with the right intensity. So some conclusions. Forest management has many climate and biodiversity smart features, but in many, if not most cases, these options are ensured being enforced by the law. This may sound like an advantage at the present, but in the future, without incentives or compensations, I don't think and the participants would consider that it wouldn't work that efficient, because all owners are crying out for either compensation or changing the legislation. There are some options which cannot be applied on small ownership, like the principle of sustained yield, but they have minor effect at country level because such small ownerships don't cover altogether very large areas. The new options proposed on very small areas, like changing species with exotics, if they would be allowed, wouldn't have a big impact on biodiversity at country level. So yeah, but they were not considered anyway a true climate and biodiversity smart measure, because participants were perceiving it as with having negative impact on biodiversity. So in many cases, incentives or support from the state or from the EU are considered a much better enabler or a true enabler to continue these or to even improve this. This is difficult because this would be very costly for the state. But the EU, on the other side, doesn't give such compensations if they are already imposed by the state rules. The state is responsible. My personal opinion is that this is not really fair. And it's like giving the prize to losers. So you give the money to those that don't do the rules you want, and you don't give similar amount of money to those that already implement them. So this makes very difficult this kind of a complex and intricate management to go on for a long time. Thank you for your attention. I hope now we will have a very interesting discussion, and I'm ready to answer all the questions you have. Hopefully I'll have the answers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tudor. It was really interesting presentation and also a great opportunity for us to connect with other Horizon projects. And the topic is really interesting for us, especially like, for example, Emilia-Romagna region, like one of our 5 regions is it's actually completely its focus is completely on sustainable forest management. So. Yeah, thank you for that. Are there any questions? Please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Well, I will get out of the full screen command. Is it okay?
Yes, as you prefer.
Okay.
Maybe like there will be specific questions on a specific rule and yeah. Well, if I mean, I might start to just to do the icebreaker. I had a couple of well, first a curiosity. So it's a really, so the state, as I understand, Romania has a really strict set of rules for forest management. And are there any monitoring schemes, like are there problems of illegal logging or other practices that are forbidden by law? Is it a problem, and do you have control, like monitoring of that, or is it not really an issue?
No. Well, it is an issue. It is an issue, and we have the most complex monitoring system probably in the world because of a very intense media. I would call it manipulation. So we were considered that we literally destroyed the Europe's green lungs by forest management. So then we have this very, very intricate and costly online system, like a citizen. For example, if you see a truck with logs on the street, you have an app on the phone, you go on the app, put the license plate, and you see if it has all the legal data in. And if you're not content, if you consider, well, this is not true, you can call the emergency calling number and report it, and the police will stop and check them. So we have, and this is strictly monitored. I mean, it was always monitored. There were some periods of time after the forest restitution, but that is like 15, 20 years ago. And because the law was not enforced properly and the restitution process was not done properly, there were quite few areas which were illegally harvested, but they were not deforested. It was just illegal harvesting. So now we have young forests there. But yeah, at that time, it was illegally cut and sold. So the state lost the money at that moment. And just to give you an idea, one very simple tool. I believe maybe the participants have heard of. Let me see. If you heard of Landscape Integrity Index, have you heard of that? Let me go there and have a share index. So
at the moment, we can see only the presentation.
Yeah. But I need to open it and show it to you. So there are just these satellite products with the forest across the globe. The Global Forest Watch, which is showing the changing canopy cover. So if a forest, let's go to that global. So they used an unfortunate term at the beginning. They said that what they detect is forest cover loss. So people got scared, losing forest cover. They perceive it like losing it forever. So they came with a disclaimer saying there is not necessarily illegal logging and it's not deforestation necessarily. It's just the forest cover change indeed. And so they show for this forest cover change. And I'll share the screen with you just in a moment to see how it looks. The internet is okay so far. Okay, I should stop sharing and start sharing another screen. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so this is Global Forest Watch, which shows you with red where it used to be cover and now it is not cover. I mean, the trees were cut or destroyed by wind or by insects or whatever else. And with blue, it shows you where the forest came back after. But that is happening is not immediate. So I have seen forests that are 6 meters tall already, and the product is not catching them. I don't know for what reason. So this is Europe. So if you zoom in, you can see any countries in the world. If you zoom in, you will see with red where the forests were harvested recently. And this is Romania here. And these are other parts of Europe and Northern Europe here. So you can see that there is not, particularly in Romania, more red than in other countries across Europe, even if you go more into details. So this is a product which only tells you this canopy cover change, but then they improved the product, making a new product, saying, okay, besides this change, let's add some more anthropogenic things like infrastructure, urban areas, rural areas, industrial sites, highways, railways, whatever else, which would mean more impact, anthropogenic impact. And that's the Forest Landscape Integrity Index. Do you see this now? I changed the window, or is still that one?
Yeah, we see another.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is, again, the Landscape Integrity Index. And it shows with dark green, the less or no touched forest. You see the Amazon, Alaska, Siberia. And then with light green are forests which are managed and they have human impact around, but not very high. And with brown are fragmented and places where there is quite a bit of infrastructure or human impact. So if you look on these products, these are the Carpathians of Romania. So if you look on these, despite all the turmoil on the media that the forests in Romania are destroyed, you can see that they're, in terms of fragmentation and impact, they look quite well. We do have some dark greens, but they're very small, the virgin forests that we still have, but those are very small areas. And most of the Carpathians are managed forests, but most of them are green. So there is a concern about illegal logging, and there are controls, very strict controls, even with this electronic system that I told you. And they want now to improve it even more, to bring satellites in and everything. But it is not a concern at country level in terms of affecting the forest land at country level and ecosystem services.
Thank you so much. I think it's a great example of like the role of citizen science in a integration of it in a monitoring framework. Thank you. Um, we have a question from the chat from
Mhm.
Alexis, which is our partner from Austria. His question is actually related, but more on the legal logging. So he asks that, so first of all, how have the public authorities have received the project outcome? And then, yeah, as far as media report, Romania forests seem to be under pressures because of a logging activity for big furniture companies like
Mhm.
IKEA.
Mhm. Yeah, so our project is ongoing. So we don't have delivered yet all the products. This demo case that I told you about is the deliverable, which is now to be finished and sent to the commission. Um, I'm not sure how I mean, they will probably see it as good in terms of saying, okay, we're already doing it. But then when we'll tell them, okay, but all the participants were asking for incentives or compensations, I doubt they would do too much about this. This is not a new problem. It's not that we discovered it in this demo case that private owners should receive compensations for what they do. So I'm reluctant to the success of changing this at country level, but who knows? We'll try. In terms of the pressure, which is on the forest, because of the big furniture companies, well, that's just an economic war between those companies and other companies. We don't know which. IKEA is not harvesting forests. It's just it owns forest and it does forest management. So somehow the company does forest management, including harvesting, but their furniture is not relying on the wood coming from their forest. The factories which are producing parts for their furniture, they're buying timber from the market. So not necessarily from the IKEA forests. Their forests don't look different than the other forests. So it is, again, we had a few years ago, it was a huge scandal with an Austrian company, which was producing boards. And then again, they were accused that they're logging Romania's forest, where they're not doing any logging, they're just processing timber. As you can see on these products, I mean, if that would have been a danger, these companies are in Romania for 20 years. Some are for more than 20 years. So we should have seen the results already. But again, the legislation is the same for all, and the companies that are accused now are not doing the harvesting, and only IKEA owns the forest. There are other owners as well. We have foreign owners in Romania, from Sweden, from I think Denmark, and from Finland, and from Germany. So we have large private owners, which are from other countries. But I haven't heard of any disasters on their lands. I hope this answers the question. So
Yeah, thank you, Tudor. I'm just listening to you.
Okay.
Thank you, Alexis, for jumping in. Are there any other questions from the audience? I have some more, but I don't want to get too much time. So if you
I can ask a question if you like.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you, Tudor, for your very interesting presentation. I apologize if I missed it, but I was wondering if there were considerations of climate change and how that would change fire risk. And so as maybe there would be perhaps more dry periods and that could increase the risk. And I was interested in knowing if there were considerations for the changing urban wildland interface. So as populations shift around within the country, if that interface is shifting and if the forestry management would consider those factors as well.
For the urban, I mean, we have quite a bit of areas which have been unfortunately abandoned by traditional agriculture, which is not really viable anymore. So, and they got naturally afforested. But is up to the owners if they would like to include them in the so-called forest land, and then they will become part of the forest land and subject to the forestry rules. Not too many do that, but that's how the forest land area is also increasing by this. The other one is quite challenging. We are not used to natural fires. We used to have a quite humid climate. So people still, is not that they don't think at all, but they cannot believe that we could get there and to have a problem with fires like in the Mediterranean area. So there was not too much discussion about the fire risk during our debate, but definitely in some parts of the country, like in the southern part, where we have a very severe drought quite every summer, we have some problems. But so far, fires are not natural. They do happen, but they are by mistake. Small farmers are setting fire to clean their grasslands or clean the agricultural residues after harvesting corn or wheat. So far, they're accidental anthropogenic fires. But yes, this would be probably an important challenge in the future. We still hope it won't get that bad, because that would probably also mean a quite major change in terms of species in some areas. Those that we have are not very resistant to fire. I mean, we have some that are resistant to fire, but they are not dominant so far.
In relation to Jeremy's question, I was wondering if you know if the pastoral practices are allowed within the forested areas as wildfire prevention actions.
Because fire is not a danger so far, pastoral activities in forests are forbidden. So they are allowed outside of the forest, and we have what we call woodland, something like probably those that you have in, there are present in Spain, like pastures with trees, so open canopy forest. We don't have that so far. It's very rare. But in the forest land, using the forest land for these reasons is forbidden. That is probably because so far we don't have problems with fire, and also because the forests are usually canopy closed, so we don't have too much problems with building fuel via the underground under canopy vegetation.
Thank you, Dana, for jumping in. Any other questions? Well, if not, I have a curiosity to ask you, because to me, like Romania, from the forestry standpoint, seems quite of a ideal situation. Like you have a lot of land cover for forest, and also because of these highly regulated by the state policies, like it seems it's like you're in a fairly good position with regards to climate resilience. But compare, like if you thinking about instead other European countries where the situation is much more patchy, and we have monocultures, and also urban areas relatively close to forests. So, for example, I know that dead wood in some parts, it's actually considered a bad thing to remove. What do you think would be the different actions and solutions for increasing resilience in those forests?
In other countries? Oh, so first of all, the rules that I showed you are not invented by us. They come from German and French and Swiss silviculture. They're very, very old rules. It's just that a very long time ago, the Romanian state decided to, it was the only owner that time, so all the forests belong to the state. So the state decided to go for what we call today more ecological forest management. And that meant at that time and during the time, very high costs. So thinking now from this perspective of climate and biodiversity is a plus, but thinking from the economic perspective is very costly. Just a quick example, during the pandemics, because the market was down for a few months when everything was closed and the economy was like getting into shock. In Romania, all forest managers, including the National State Forest Administration, were close to go bankrupt. The National Forest Administration had to borrow money from the bank to pay salaries. So the profit margin is so small in this kind of management that is not attractive. So that's clear. So it's not that it was a secret, but it's not that it's good for everything. So it is very challenging from an economic point of view. And that's why going to other places where the owners are not used to these heavy restrictions, I think is very difficult to implement them if you don't come with proper compensations before. So, and this is a very big challenge, but I think this should be told at EU level, because there are many things in strategies and other directives saying, okay, we will do this and that without asking how much that costs. So doing all these rules that I told you about in a country where the forests or large areas were managed for economic reasons, it's a nightmare in terms of costs. I'm not saying that the owners will accept it anyway. They might say, well, I don't care even if you give me money. This is my tradition. But it will be a nightmare. I'm not saying that, I mean, we should face it and we should go and try and say, okay, how much this would cost? Because if we really consider that the forests are a very good and important tool to provide all these ecosystem services, we should be aware of the cost. Otherwise, you know, there is a very famous saying coming from the US, conservation without money is just conversation. So if we want to do something, we need to know the costs, and then I think we can apply it. And we do have, I think, very good examples in Romania for success in doing some things, and also not very successful things like the economic viability and others. But it's possible to replicate, but I think it's very costly.
Thank you so much. I think we have reached the end of the time. Thank you again, Tudor, for your super interesting presentation. Unfortunately, we had a little bit less participants than normal, but because in some northern European countries, vacation has started. Nevertheless, we recorded this meeting and this webinar, so it will be available for project partners. So I wanted to thank you again for your availability, and I wanted to remind participants of that we stop for the summer vacations, and we see each other again for the next webinar, the 4th of our series on the 19th of September, which will be Alexis presenting it. And for instead model region and fellow region partners, we see each other at the next progress meeting on the 5th of September. So I take this opportunity to wish you all a good and lovely time during your summer vacations. Hope you managed to spend some time in the forest and in nature. And thank you again.
Well, thank you for the invitation. And if there are any other questions, write me an email. We can discuss. No.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Wish you a nice summer.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you, Gloria.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye.